Hello everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Capitol Watch, our review of the 2017 regular session of the Missouri General Assembly and its impact on public education. And joining me for this discussion is Mike Reed, our Associate Executive Director for Advocacy and our Chief Lobbyist, Mike Grote, a Governmental Relations Consultant for MSBA, and Mike Winter, Governmental Relations Consultant for MSBA. And gentlemen, thanks a lot for being with us. We appreciate it. Mike Reed, first of all, give us an overview of the session. How did it go overall?
Well, it was a very interesting session. This was the first time in a number of years where the House, the Senate, and the governor's office have all been under the same party. And as such, there were a number of things that were going through as gangbusters at the start. But in the end, it kind of slowed down quite a bit. There were the first bills out of the chute were labor bills, right to work, and tort reform bills. But as the session continued, things started to become a little dysfunctional in the Senate. There were egos that kind of walked after each other, and the Senate kind of bogged down. The House was run by a pretty well-oiled machine, but the Senate kind of had some problems. So in the end, there were only about 58 bills that were passed, which is down from the past several years. But it was a productive year as far as labor issues were concerned, and it was a productive year as far as funding for schools were concerned.
Mike Grote, speaking of funding, we have a fully funded foundation formula, the result of legislative action. Tell us about that.
Sure. So this actually started back months ago at our spring conference, where we had Representative Fitzpatrick came in and spoke to us at that time, and he said that he was committing to fully funding the formula. And that's something he held true to. Representative Fitzpatrick is the chairman of the House Budget Committee, and he fought really hard all session long to make sure that K-12 had the funding it needed to be fully funded. Now, as that process went through the Senate, it ended up working out that stayed, and we have full funding of the foundation formula for the first time in a number of years. Now, the trick to that, though, is going to be where all the funding comes from. So what we've seen is lottery proceeds are actually down right now, and as they were moving the budget around, making sure we had the funding for both the formula, transportation, et cetera, they had to take some of those funds from lottery proceeds fund part of that process. And as they are so far down, roughly 30%, we could see some withholds as we go through this fiscal year, either from the formula or from transportation or somewhere to make sure those dollars balance. But right now, it's a great year for K-12.
Very good news for our schools. But as you said, Mike, our districts probably ought to be cautious about anticipating that entire amount. Is that correct?
Exactly. So I think we always caution everybody to be aware that we're just now at the beginning of this budget process, and there are still a couple hurdles that have to go through. The governor is still going to review this budget and sign it. He does have the authority to line item veto. He also has the authority to withhold if revenues aren't there. So we need to make sure that our districts are being mindful of that, and that they're watching revenues that are coming into the state.
And fully funding the formula, Mike, also triggers a previous law that provides for some funding for pre-K education in our state, and that could have an impact, I would think.
It definitely could. And so essentially the trigger is anytime the foundation formula is fully funded, you have additional funding for early childhood. And now the question is, well, where do those additional monies come from? Because that's something that actually wasn't planned for as we went through this budget process.
Mm-hmm. Mike Winter, another bill of interest to our members has to do with bonding. Can you tell us about that?
Certainly. Over the last number of years, we've seen some interest primarily from state auditors pushing legislation dealing with requiring competitive bidding on bond obligations rather than negotiated sales. Representative Vescovo this session picked up that mantle and filed a couple different bills. One was stopped in the House Financial Institutions Committee, but he filed a second bill which was referred to another committee, which became a vehicle out on the floor for some discussion. Even though that bill didn't move forward, he attached the bonding provisions into a number of bills which did pass. So we will be seeing some differences relating to competitive versus negotiated sales. And you'll see a new phrase in the bills, which we haven't seen a whole lot of, a municipal advisor. And there is a threshold that passed in the legislation of $12.5 million threshold. So if you're below that amount, you can still do negotiated sales. If you're above that amount, there are some things you're going to have to do such as use a municipal advisor. But part of the legislation that passed did make a special definition to be inclusive of CFOs for school districts who are CPAs or are accredited with master's degrees, which would be considered municipal advisors for those bond obligation sales.
Another issue that received a lot of attention, Mike, was the student transfer issue, and that's been on the legislature's plate for several years now. What happened, if anything, on that?
The standalone bills did not pass. I know Mike Reed's going to talk about the ESA bill a little bit because it was incorporated into that when it moved out of the Senate, but the standalone bill in the House did not pass. The title to it was fairly broad, elementary and secondary education, so as you can imagine, when the bill goes to the floor, there's all sorts of amendments that get offered unrelated to the transfer piece. Representative Wood's transfer bill probably was one we've seen and worked on in prior years, but a number of the amendments that were attached to in particular dealt with hardship transfers and those applications going to the commissioner and how those would have an appeal mechanism if he or she decided not to grant those appeals. There were other amendments, Mike, I don't know if you want to mention any of those that were attached, but in the end, the bill passed out of the House, went to the Senate, and was not taken up in the Senate.
And Mike Reed, another issue that received some attention was expansion of virtual education. Where did that go?
Virtual education, there were several virtual education bills that made it through the House of Representatives, but they never passed the Senate. The virtual education bill was something that the governor was very important to the governor. He wanted to have more virtual education in the state of Missouri. The bill started out very simply that if you have not have the classes offered in your high school, you could do virtual education. It got expanded. In the end, that bill died, but I do think we'll see that coming back in the future.
Mm-hmm. Another bill received a lot of attention during the session, Mike, had to do with the Missouri Human Rights Act and some revisions to that.
The Human Rights Act bill passed. Things got changed in the Human Rights Act. There was a whole bunch of questions on that. The bill that got passed narrowed down who could be sued, where they can be sued, the amount of money that can be received, plus the fact that it changed one of the motivating factors to contributing factors. So originally it was a contributing factor. That's all you had to prove was a contributing factor. The discrimination was one part of the whole situation to win. That got changed to a motivating factor, that this was in fact the reason, the discrimination that you're talking about was the reason for the problem. So there was a big change in that piece of legislation.
And Mike, that's important to school districts because they get sued under this law occasionally, don't they?
They do get sued quite often under this law, and changing from the factors that are looked at by a jury perhaps will save school districts money.
Mm-hmm. A couple of other big issues, Mike, that we spent a lot of time on during the session had to do with the Education Savings Account bill, which was Senate Bill 313, and also charter school expansion, House Bill 634. Those bills did not make it through. We were worried about those bills. Tell us about those.
The charter bill expansion started out in the House, and we put some amendments on that made the bill much better for us. In the end, that bill did not pass. The Senate was held in the Senate committee and was never got a discussion in the Senate. I believe that you will see in the future more charter bills coming out, and we will keep working on them to make sure that the charter bills reflect our resolutions and how they are handled. The Educational Savings Account bill passed the Senate, but it had a lot of things put on it. Educational savings accounts are not in a savings account like you're thinking about, like a college savings account. This is in fact a voucher bill, and this bill was tailored for students with disabilities, students in foster care, and students that are in the military, whose families are in the military. The bill passed the Senate, that it had a lot of things included, including a large transfer bill, and that transfer bill had on it, among other things, accreditation by school building. When it ran into the House, the House had hearings on it, but it was held in the House committee and not reported to the House floor. So it died.
Mm-hmm. So those were really two major victories for us, Mike. And did our members play a role with the contacts they made?
They did, especially on the educational savings account. People made a tremendous number of contacts, And that was one of the things that held that in committee. I think, if you all will agree, that membership getting in and saying that this is not good for our local districts. It was not good for the kids in the state of Missouri. This is again, it's a voucher bill without any overlooking and overseeing exactly to make sure that the money is spent wisely. But that being said, we will see those bills again, perhaps shortly.
So in the meantime, Mike Reed, our members still need to maintain contact with their legislators, don't they?
Yeah, this is a great time. The legislators are home. It is time to talk to them. It's time to thank those legislators for fully funding the formula. We complain to our reps and senators all the time about not meeting their obligations. This time they went out on a limb and did that. So it's time to thank them for doing that, but it's also time to discuss with them how their actions affect people at home. Their actions in Jeff City affect people at home. And especially, let's talk about the ESA bill, because I do believe that's going to come back very soon, and people have to understand that this is not the educational savings account they think of. It is, in fact, a voucher bill, and it's something that probably is not good for public education.
All right, Mike Reed, Mike Grote, Mike Winter, thanks a lot for being with us on our program, and thanks a lot for all your good work that you did advocating for public schools during the past regular session of the General Assembly. And you'll, I'm sure, keep us posted on any new developments with a special session and other issues that may emerge affecting public education. So thanks a lot for being with us. And we thank you for being with us on this special edition of MSBA's Capital Watch.